for putting this panel together and hosting us. My name is Peter Olney. I am based in San Francisco, California. I'm the retired organizing director of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and I'll be your moderator today for this wonderful panel that we put together. So just as a brief introduction, in 2018, the California State Supreme Court issued the Dynamex decision. And this was a decision that said that there will be a simple ABC test, a three-part test, applied to determine whether an individual is an employee or a contractor. This was a very progressive decision. And California codified that decision into law with Assembly Bill 5 in 2019. Uber and Lyft and DoorDash et al. Saw that their business model was threatened and bankrolled a ballot initiative to carve out rideshare drivers from the provisions of AB 5. Rideshare Drivers United, and we have Nicole Moore, one of the founders and leaders of RDU, a grassroots organization of Uber and Lyft drivers, campaigned valiantly against Prop 22. They were joined by the California Labor Federation and its affiliates in opposing this proposition. But they were outgunned and outmessaged and outspent $205 million to $14 million. The vote was overwhelming, 59% in favor of Prop 22. So now Massachusetts and other states will be next in the battle for justice for rideshare drivers and gig workers. Today's panel will help us understand challenges facing rideshare drivers, the lessons from California, and the prospects for defeating the Uber-Lyft juggernaut in Massachusetts. So we're going to have 5 to 8 minute presentations by our panelists, Katie Wells, Nicole Moore, and Rand Wilson, and then some time for a roundtable among the panelists and questions from our attendees. Put your questions in the chat box, and if you're not speaking or talking, mute yourself. So now I hope to help frame the discussion and add a little emotional power to the issue, I'd like to watch this brief clip from a trailer for this wonderful British movie made by the famous filmmaker Ken Loach. It's called Sorry We Missed You, and the horrors of gig employment in rideshare and delivery know no boundaries. So if we can show that video, let's roll it. It's about 50 seconds from the trailer. I commend the movie to everyone.
Concreting, plumbing.
Is that you two?
I've done it all.
So why'd you give it up?
It's just gone from job to job.
There's always someone on your back, isn't there?
Come on, we've got time to make up, let's go.
I'd rather work on my own now. Be my own boss.
Let's just get a few things straight at the start though, shall we?
Hi, Rosie. Wake up. Dad will go mental if you miss school again.
No, if you don't move, then you're going to get a ticket.
Oh, Rosie.
You know, but laugh. You don't work for us, you work with us.
0-hour contract to get paid for the visits.
Keep this happy.
Yes.
Track every parcel, don't they? To the front door and the back door. Even if you put one in the garden shed, they know where it lands. Fucking hell! The dog down there with massive teeth, I think it stuck the chunk out of my ass.
This decides who lives and who dies.
You were storm.
It wasn't me, it was your mum. Says for Mr. Campbell. Robert, not keeps on partnering.
Sorry, 50 seconds. Is that okay, Peter?
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I know the audio was difficult. I commend that movie to everyone. It had me in tears by the end. The horrors of the gig economy are illustrated beautifully by Ken Loach. Okay, we're going to get rolling here. Our first panelist is Dr. Katie Wells. She's a postdoctoral research fellow at Georgetown University. She's trained as a geographer and writes about the changing relationship between tech and cities. For the last 5 years, she has studied 40 gig workers in the DC area and 30 policymakers who were involved in governing and not governing their labor platforms. She has published findings on labor rights, housing policy, and Washington, D.C. history in academic journals, and discussed the real-time impacts in more than 60 media stories. She's a native of Canton, Ohio, and she's lived in D.C. for 17 years. Katie.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks to Nicole and Rand for doing this panel with me. It is lovely to be here. I want to offer a few comments about what it means to be in the gig workplace and about the incredible barriers there are to doing the kind of work that Nicole and others have done. For Mateo, a 35-year-old Peruvian immigrant, the pandemic has meant not only the end of his job as a valet manager in Washington, D.C., it's also meant the end of 4 years of work as an Uber driver. When we spoke last summer, Mateo said, "Sometimes I leave the Uber app open for 5 hours and I don't get any trips. It's terrible." He tried to drive for Uber Eats and Grubhub, but couldn't get approved on one app or snag orders on the other. And yet, in the midst of his own severe concerns, Mateo worries about his peers, especially those who lease cars. It's $215 average every week for the lease. How are they going to pay it? Such worries are shared by Jabari, a Black 30-year-old IT professional also in DC, who switched from Uber to Instacart when the pandemic arrived. He said, quote, "It's kind of sad that people still drive for Uber. I feel bad for all these drivers. A lot of them, it's all they have." I heard this refrain over and over in conversations last summer with workers who I've been interviewing and surveying for the last 5 years. Workers like Mateo and Jabari harbor worries for their peers. They worry that peers aren't earning enough, getting the right amount of unemployment insurance, or staying healthy in the face of our global pandemic. More than compassionate thoughts, though, such worries hold important potential, I argue, all right? They're seeds of care. Someone once joked, ha ha ha, that platforms do what moms do, Happy Mother's Day early. They do meal prep, chauffeuring, laundry, errands. Platforms help us perform the work of social reproduction, but through the market, right? And therein lies part of the problem. Platforms present themselves as solutions to actually existing problems of austerity, underemployment, decaying mass transit, and deep-seated racial and economic inequalities. And yet platforms offer up solutions in a very particular way that limit our ideas about how life could actually be led otherwise, okay? Ideas about worker co-ops, right? But also investments in public infrastructure like childcare, debt relief, decent wages, shorter work weeks, right? You guys know the list. Platform companies seem to understand the present crisis. They know that it involves widespread alienation, both in and beyond the workplace. And they also know that it concerns how we care for each other. Many, like Jabari and Mateo, work to overcome that alienation by worrying over and talking to others. And what's important about their worries, or seeds of care, as I'll call them, is not that they exist. Rather, what is important is just how difficult it is to tend to them, to allow those seeds to grow into trust, relationships, or even, because it's May Day, let's say a collective worker consciousness. In a study, my colleagues and I found that Uber drivers do not only not know peers on the platform when they begin work, they also don't meet them in the course of everyday work. 78% of the 40 drivers that I first interviewed in 2016 said they had never had a meal or drink with another Uber driver. They did not chat with them in online forums. They did not text them from their phones, and they did not say hello if they thought they saw one at a gas station. We found a similar situation 3 years later. 33% of drivers in our study still did not know any other current or former drivers. This sociospatial isolation or atomization, right, seems to have a point. to keep platform workers as strangers. The lack of physical space in which platform workers meet regularly creates a material barrier, a real, hard, fast barrier to forming collective identities, and deeply shapes the possibilities of a collective worker consciousness. Susanna, a white, widowed, 59-year-old Uber driver who also works on the side as a freelance writer and a home inspector, explained. She said, quote, "It's really, really difficult to organize a group like this because even with all the online resources, there is no place where you can go, like a workplace, where you can reach people. Put differently, there's no obvious place where you can turn a stranger into someone for whom you do the hard work of caring, trusting, and maintaining tedious relationships." A scholar, Amanda Huron, says, quote, "The pressures of life in a capitalist city leave less time for nurturing bonds with family and friends, let alone creating new ties with strangers." And here's the kick. Yet, in order to change the balance of power, which we all here, right, are working to do, what is precisely needed is to create networks with people who were once strangers, but who could become allies and even friends. To build solidarities, to practice anti-capitalist living, to prepare more just futures, we must tend to seeds of care. The worries for others that platform workers expressed last summer are these very seeds of thinking and living otherwise that our efforts require. Counter-hegemonic power, the kind of stuff we're trying to build, right, piecemeal, requires a collective or a group made up of individuals that not only see one another, but care for one another, which is why the work of gig organizers in California and elsewhere is so darn remarkable. In a workplace of such extreme
processes, and they tend to be
in a workplace of such extreme isolation that anyone has worked together is remarkable. And the fact that we, and I say that broadly, failed to stop Prop 22 does not mean that we can't stop it elsewhere, like in Massachusetts. And the fact that we, and here I mean more locally, we in DC, failed to sustain a driver organization beyond a few years does not mean that we won't do so in the future. Like a child who learns to walk by falling down over and over again, so too may we learn how to take care of one another outside of market forces by first falling down a good number of times. The challenges of creating anti-capitalist futures and the problems to me encountered along the way are substantial, right, which we all know, but so too is the need for weaving new networks of care and trust, which is what I think and hope that we might be starting to do today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Katie. That was a beautiful presentation and a beautiful challenge to organizers. So hopefully we'll be able to meet that challenge in our discussion here. So we're going to move to our second panelist. I asked for bios from our panelists and Nicole gave me the briefest bio. She's a friend and she's a part-time Lyft driver and she's a leader and founder of Rideshare Drivers United, a California driver organization with 19,000 members. Nicole lives in the Los Angeles area, and I could say much more about her and the brilliant work she's done, but that was her bio that she submitted to me, so I'm going to let her rip. Go ahead, Nicole.
Everything else is irrelevant, Peter, so thank you for the introduction. Just to give you a little history on Rideshare Drivers United, all of the things that Katie said are absolutely true. Our job is extremely isolating. I took on driving because I needed extra income to pay for rising housing costs, basically. And so I have a good full-time job. And but it wasn't enough to pay for my increased housing costs. So I started driving just part-time, like a night a week to make up the income gap. And what I found was, it was very, the only relationship I had was with my phone. I didn't have a relationship with coworkers. And I quickly found that what was happening with, my job was that my income was going down. It had no relationship to what I was supposed to be earning when I started. I was supposed to get 80% of the passenger fares, and it quickly disconnected. I was getting as little as 40 and sometimes 30% of the fares, depending on what was going on. And, so I started looking around, and indeed there were some people organizing. Back in 2017, there were some significant reductions to what the companies were paying drivers, and folks got together. It was like 40 people, and they did a work action at LAX, and they said, we need, better pay. And, so anyway, that was the group that became Rideshare Drivers United in 2018. And we started, I found folks, and we started building, there was no way that 40 people was going to be able to challenge, these multi-billion-dollar companies. And so we, one of our members, founding members, was also a software engineer, and he started helping us build an app to be able to collect and communicate as organizers with other drivers. And I think that's, we developed a hybrid organizing model. We were extremely committed to building relationships across, the industry, and person-to-person stuff, not just like Facebook likes and that kind of thing. Plus, we had, tech to help us basically build the break room that we could talk to each other and meet. Because we, other than a few locations like the airport, most drivers don't know each other. So, we started in 2018 with like 400 people on our list. And we made a plan, and we, I think we started growing very quickly after our first action in front of the governor's office in 2019. And we really were committed to being the voice of drivers. And we polled every single driver that hooked up with us, and we developed a Rideshare Driver Bill of Rights. And, it became very clear what our goals were. They were fair pay and a voice on the job. And, as we developed, this was the year 2019 that these companies were IPOing and were standing to get billions of dollars from investors. And while we were literally, some of our coworkers, you have to decide whether to buy a sandwich because you haven't eaten all day, or whether you're going to use that money to put gas in your tank so you can buy, gas and work some more that day. And because of the companies were literally using us as their wallets, squeezing our pay to look better for investors. And so our earnings plummeted during their IPO year. And so that's when we held a strike, and we held another strike that went international 2 days before Uber's IPO, and got the voice of drivers in front of the entire public and really started to shift the conversation about what's happening in these companies. So I think, it's that context that we as drivers decided that we absolutely thought the best way to achieve our goals was to have a legally enforceable contract. How do you do that? You unionize. You can't do that unless you're employees. And so we started to really support the fight for AB 5, which is the legislation that codified that we were employees. Of course, there was a pushback from the company, and that's what Prop 22 was. When the law took effect, let's be clear, the companies never followed the law. So that's when we started doing wage claims with the Labor Commission of California. We figured out how to make wage claims, to remove the barrier for drivers to be able to do wage claims by creating a web tool that they can file wage claims through their phone. And more than 5,000 drivers across California filed wage claims within a couple of months. It equaled $1.3 billion in damages and lost wages and unpaid expenses. And what was so important to me about that was like, there are some really high earning drivers, who have the best strategies and are really bringing home money, right? But when they sat down and did their wage claims, they were owed, $100,000, $200,000 for driving for the past 3 years, because the company offloads their entire fleet expenses to the drivers. So you bring home $200, but it's really only $120. And how many hours did you spend on the road to get it? So employee rights are extremely important to this. There's nothing innovative about this level of wage exploitation. And, that's where we're at. So let me just look at my notes. I think what Prop 22 did is it established a permanent second class for worker status for app-based workers. So as a majority people of color and immigrant workforce, we sit with farm workers and domestic workers and are not covered under the basic labor laws of the country, which frankly it's not a high bar. It's minimum wage. It's Social Security employer paid. It's workers' compensation. It's very, very dangerous. Now, what I want to get to is how did they win Prop 22 in a state that is basically in support of drivers' rights and workers' rights? How did that happen? So Peter talked about the money. There's a striking, like when somebody spends $200 million on getting a deceptive, message to voters, it has a huge impact. So let's be clear about that. But what are those deceptions and how do we get around it? Because it's happening not just, it's not just happened here in California. It's going to happen all over the country, Massachusetts, that's where we need to talk about how to overcome it. But I think the first thing is that the ABC test is normal. Lots of states use it already to determine employment. But the deception is that ABC test is costing hundreds of millions of independent jobs. It's just people are just losing jobs left and right because now they're not independent contractors, they're employees. I haven't seen real data on that. And it's not true. It's not like there's no independent contractors in Massachusetts where they actually have the ABC test. Another of the big lies is that app-based work is just part-time work. And it's a way for people to earn that's flexible and awesome that, they need. Well, what's the problem in an economy where you have a full-time job and have to get a second job to pay for stuff? Number one, right? Like our standards are too low as they are. We need to lift everybody up. Having a second job that's underpaid is really rough, because like for me, it meant I started with one night a week and I ended up doing 2 nights a week and a couple of mornings, right? So for me, it impacted my life as well because I had to keep working more. But the economy, the gig economy is not based on part-time workers. They incentivize drivers to work full-time, saying things like, if you do 160 rides this week, you'll get this bonus. The majority of miles for Lyft and Uber are driven by full-time workers. So we're not just it's the same argument we've always had is like, oh, well, it's a McDonald's job. It doesn't matter. It's just high school students. It's not true. A lot of people are counting on this income. The other thing is that Lyft and Uber with their $200 million were really good about trying to capture this idea that these jobs actually help the community, help single mothers, help people of color. So how could we take these jobs away from that workforce? And suppressing the idea that labor rights basically lifts this workforce up. Labor rights, such as minimum wage, have never hurt, majority people of color workforce. It's just not true. The other big message is around flexibility and independent contracting. It's not, one of my favorite people in RDU always talks about, are you really flexible if you can't, take your kids to Disneyland over the weekend because you can't afford not to work, nor do you have enough money to take them? Are you flexible if all of a sudden you're working, 12 hours a day in order to make the same thing you were making 7 or 8 hours a day, 2 years ago? Like, is this real flexibility? It's not flexibility. The fact that we have an app that allows us to schedule, ourselves is not something that is disallowed by labor law. It's not something that's taken away from, it's the employer's choice. And, should we organize and have a union and have a contract, we would fight for that kind of flexibility. So I think important too, is that we do need the right to bargain a contract, but we need that floor. So one of the things that the companies have done a really good job about is try to say, well, we'll bargain with you, but we don't want you to have labor rights because they don't want us to have a wage floor. So, we cannot have bargaining without labor rights. And that's not going to help drivers. We'll be just like farm workers and domestic workers working to bargain our way up to the floor that every other employee has. So, and I think, I'd be remiss not to say that this is not just about gig workers. It's not just about app-based delivery and driving drivers. This is coming for every job. If we can app-based teaching, healthcare, construction work, all this work becomes gig work and none of it has labor rights. We have to solve the issue. So I hope that gives a little bit of structure around, because I'm very interested in getting the lessons that we learned in California out to every other state, so that, the campaigns can be run with full intelligence about what's going to happen. The second thing is, as RDU, we're really committed to helping other like-minded groups of drivers with our hybrid organizing model, including the tech. And we've shared that with many of the smaller groups that are starting to grow. And we want to be able to share that as well as far as we can. It's the only way we're going to win. So I think that covers it.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. I think the emotion and passion that you bring to this discussion is indicative of the hybrid model, because this is not a social media construct here, this RDU. This is real organizing on the ground. I've seen it up close. And so I salute the work of RDU. It's inspired thousands of drivers here and worldwide. So we're going to go to our third panelist, and then we'll come back around to a full board discussion here with our panelists and also with you, the participants in this workshop. So the next panelist is an old and dear friend of mine. I think we first bonded knocking on doors in the Bromley Heath housing projects in Boston, where we were trying to recruit workers into a union drive that Rand was leading. He's worked as a union organizer for nearly 40 years and is currently an organizer and chief of staff for Service Employees Local 888 in Boston. He was the founding director of Massachusetts Jobs with Justice. He's been active in electoral politics. In 2015, he helped to co-found Labor for Bernie and was elected as a Sanders delegate to the 2016 Democratic National Convention. In 2020, he was a Sanders appointee to the DNC's 2020 Credentials Committee. He's a member of Our Revolution Somerville. He's the board chair for the ICA group and the Fund for Jobs Worth Owning. He's a trustee for the Somerville Job Creation and Retention Trust, an elected member of the Ward 6 Somerville Democratic Committee, and convener of a community labor coalition, Somerville Stands Together. And that's a very brief bio for Rand. There's a lot more there, but let's let Ram talk about the challenge of Uber and Lyft and rideshare gig economy in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Peter. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the organizers for the conference and for this panel, and my co-presenters, which have covered a great deal of the ground. And Peter has just posted an article that we co-authored together in anticipation of this workshop so that we would be well prepared. And he's posted the link to that in the chat. I will just make a couple of remarks here, and then we'll get into the discussion. As Nicole said, you know, this with the success of Prop 22 in California, Uber and Lyft are exporting their drive to undo workers' rights and to carve out rideshare drivers in a number of states, including the one that I live in, Massachusetts. And I think also, you know, there's some indications that they'll be going ahead in other states as well, like Colorado, possibly New Jersey, Connecticut, other areas where the independent contractor status that they are trying to preserve with its opportunity for hyper exploitation of workers, where that independent contractor status is threatened. They're going to be forming grass top coalitions like the one they've put together here in Massachusetts called the Coalition for Independent Work. And, you know, this is a phony group, but, you know, it's staffed by a PR agency and campaign consultants here in Boston. And, you know, they filed a bill in the legislature here that's really identical to what they proposed in California with Prop 22, because the ABC test in California is based on the Massachusetts ABC test. And so the language is very similar. That bill in the legislature is, you know, probably, if I was a betting man, I'd say it's dead on arrival. It's never going to get out of committee. But I think the threat of the ballot initiative in 2022, November 2022, is real. And we can anticipate the same kind of massive spending and shrewd framing of the issue that could persuade Massachusetts voters that this is, in fact, going to improve the lives of drivers. And I think that was kind of one of Nicole's points, is that people thought that they were voting, I think, to make the drivers' lives better, that this would improve their wages and working conditions. And, you know, we've got a massive job ahead of us to inoculate people in Massachusetts that the proposal would not only hurt the future for the Uber and Lyft drivers, but that this is a concern of all workers. And I think Nicole closed on that point, which is if we make this just about Uber and Lyft drivers, we're going to be probably battling against a message that we can't beat. But I feel like if we can make this understood as an attack on all workers and an attempt to undermine workers' rights everywhere, that we might have a better chance of persuading the Massachusetts electorate to say no to the Uber and Lyft initiative. But we've got a group here in Massachusetts. I've just joined the advisory board for the Boston Independent Drivers Guild, and we're going to need to organize over the next year and a half to make sure that we've got a robust organization of drivers that are committed to organizing and to achieving their employee rights, and that can be articulate spokespeople for the need to defeat the Prop 22 lookalike initiative in Massachusetts. I think that's very important. Some more good news, in my opinion, for Massachusetts campaign. 2022 will have I think a very vigorous contest for the governor's race that can be help catalyze and bring out a progressive vote. And we'll also have an initiative to amend our state constitution to allow what we call a millionaires or fair share tax on the rich for public services that I think is going to be quite popular. And we'll also be bringing out a large progressive vote in November 2022. At the federal level, nobody's mentioned some pretty good developments that are worth noting. Marty Walsh, yesterday or the day before yesterday, made a very unequivocal statement about the importance of defining who's a contractor and establishing that that employees should have their rights. And then Biden has appointed David Weil, or reappointed David Weil to the wage and hour in the Department of Labor. And he is certainly one of the most strongest proponents of against misclassification of employees as independent contractors, and has a great track record of trying to enforce those rules and to get the federal government behind employee rights. So why don't I just stop there? Oh, and last but not least, the PRO Act has features that I'm not sure, but if it were to pass, the PRO Act would enshrine that ABC test that we have in Massachusetts and that you used to have with Dynamax and AB5 in California. It would enshrine that in federal labor law. And so passage of the PRO Act would, in my opinion, preempt Prop 22 in California. So I'm not a lawyer, I haven't studied that, but it certainly is more reason than ever to get behind the PRO Act and to support its passage if it could undo the California Prop 22. A win in Massachusetts would mean that we are, that would really propel momentum for the PRO Act if we haven't passed it by then. And a win in Massachusetts would certainly send a message that that Uber and Lyft can't buy their way for this continued hyper exploitation of labor. On the other hand, we should be very concerned that this is not just a state fight. This is not a parochial issue. This is a national battleground, And we are going to need everybody's help to stop Uber and Lyft and the DoorDash and the other gig economy companies that are looking for this carve out. We need to stop them in Massachusetts, because if it does pass here, that's a signal that will be extremely detrimental for the other states that are facing similar campaigns. And, you can imagine the glee of the gig economy companies if they are able to start log rolling one state after another and bury these critical rights for employees. I'll stop there. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Rand.
I'm just posted in the chat a link to one of Uber's ads about flexibility. And they're already all over Massachusetts with these ads about the benefits of flexibility for immigrant workers, people of color.
Yeah. And Rand, I
Worth
just wanted
watching.
to amplify what you said, which is that, we fought so hard against Prop 22. We found it really effective when we were calling voters and saying, hey, I'm a driver and this is going to hurt me. Because in general, the public of California didn't want to hurt drivers. They wanted to help drivers. But people were absolutely deceived by the advertising. I had more than 12 friends of mine approach me after the election and say, congratulations on winning Prop 22. And I said, it took our labor rights away. And they were like, what? And then, a couple of them were like, well, I'm a DoorDasher. Oh my God, I took my own rights away. People were deceived.
Right.
And they have been, right? I mean, on some level, like one of the things we followed here is how they, like DC in some ways, how they won DC over the last few years, right? The last decade now, it was batting practice for what happened in California. And so much of that was a messaging, right? That Nicole and Rand say. And I put a link to, one of the Spike Lee early film series glorifying it. But we see it around disability rights access, how they sort of, said, hey, this is great, right? Where in fact it's not. And the same thing for racial justice. There's this like very genius narrative, that sort of sells the company as being good for these causes that actually, it undermines.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask a tough question though, Nicole and others on our panel. So I hear what you're saying about the way people felt about this, including drivers and the general public's perception. But Nicole, if we had to do it over again, what could we do differently in California to win? How do you assess that? What could we have done differently? What was missing in our battle against obviously big money? We were outspent. We're going to be outspent in Massachusetts. That's a given. But how could we have won? What should we have done differently? What should the labor movement have done differently, Nicole?
I mean, it was a very hard year because everybody was pouring all their resources into the national battle, right? But I mean, if you look at the propositions over the years in California that have had high spending in them, it's always the side with money that wins. But what I'll say was I look at our campaign, I think we missed opportunities. I think, our messaging was very plain. Again, had we given the consultants who do the communications more money, they could have done more variety and had more hits and that kind of thing. But it was just very plain. I mean, we didn't put real workers' lives up there, and Lyft and Uber did. I mean, they were actors, but they sure read like real workers, right? The other thing that, so I think, number one, you have to build a broad-based coalition that includes, right now, America is making a demand for equity and the end to, racist structures in our society. Well, what more important than having people organize and have, labor rights? I mean, that's one of the main things that helps us equalize people's access. And we did not get in front of that issue. You'll see no advertisements. We tried to do it. We actually, we're in LA. All of us think we're filmmakers, and we made some of our own commercials with drivers talking about what our lives really were like. I mean, they didn't get the exposure that they needed, but I do think those voices are really important. I mean, I think the other opportunities that you have to be aware of is that the companies have complete control over how they do the app. And in preparation for Prop 22, the company started giving drivers a lot more control over their earnings. We got something called a multiplier, where you could set, up to, there's the price, and then there's, double, triple, quadruple, up to 5 times you could set a multiplier in your app. So you were starting to feel like, wow, I really have control over my earnings, and I am setting my own prices, right? Because none of us ever set our own prices. That was the first time in the history of Uber that they ever let us set our own prices. Well, and guess what happened last week? The multiplier was taken away. And we now have drivers who voted yes for 22 because they thought maybe this is a way that we can actually guarantee some of the things that we know these jobs have never had, that allow us to set our own earnings, whatever, right? They've taken away those folks who voted yes are now all over our Facebook pages and everything saying, this should be against the law. Like, Prop 22 passed, and now they're taking away our ability to set our own prices. So they have so much control. They were getting messages to all of the passengers. Okay, so the state needs the data. They need the data on who are the employees. They need the data on who are the passengers. The companies messaged passengers and drivers on a daily basis. Drivers is a fairly small group compared to the voting public. But think of the passengers, the millions that got in-app messages constantly, control the price, help drivers have a better, way to live, vote yes on 22. And then would have, a driver saying, yay on 22, and then they got drivers to sign stuff that said they supported 22. Many of us had a lot of fun with that because, of course, we didn't support it, but and then they would send the passenger, when they were with a driver that had signed that, and said, your driver is voting yes on 22, ask them why. So you have to build a broad-based coalition. It has to be the focus, of labor pushing back. And you have to build a multiracial immigrant and non-immigrant community of support around that, because they're going to kill you in that area if you don't do the work that we all have to do for all campaigns, but Lyft and Uber are going to get ahead of you on it.
I just wonder if either Katie or Rand has further thoughts on beating Prop 22s, and then I want to shift to some other issues around gig worker organizing.
My only thought is that California, a lot the way that drivers got snookered is a good story to tell in Massachusetts. That there was a false promise there. So we actually have a situation where you can point to the fact that these promises were made, but they weren't followed through on, and that it was, a big lie, and that'll help.
Katie, you have any thoughts on this?
I'll offer 2 quick thoughts. One is, thank you so much, Nicole and Rand, for sharing this. I'm learning so much. And the second is that when we look back in DC around that, Nicole, you said that we need 2 things as we think about the price floor, but also collective bargaining. Yeah. In DC in 2012, Uber unveiled sort of this like consumer loyalty being rebranded as civic action. when it got, constituents to write to their policymakers and get rid of a price floor that had been negotiated. And so when we look at what happened in DC with losing out on the worker rights, what has become apparent is the extent to which, as I mentioned, the racial justice narrative and the disability, the question of accessibility, really became powerful levers in public discourse. And so as I mentioned, the DC effort, around this issue has, I think responsibly sunset itself for now, even though they really appreciate the support from RDU and the Solidarity app. But when I think about Massachusetts and the battles, I think there is room, and this sucks to say it, but to move to make sure that the labor is not the only argument at play, that to make friends, right, with the racial justice, narratives, as well as those around accessibility, because they have been totally screwed as well.
Yeah, workplace safety as well as passenger safety polled really well, but we didn't have the cash to move that statewide. I think that was a really, I agree with you on that, Katie.
Good. So we'll certainly open up chat for questions from folks who are participating in this workshop. I would like our panelists to address a little bit of a different topic. Some in our labor movement have argued that this gig economy and this flexibility is inevitable, and that we ought to create a third way of employment between employee and contractor, and strike collective bargaining deals or sectoral labor agreements with these giant companies. What's wrong with that vision?
Peter, the Machinists Union in Massachusetts has a proposal to a legislation that they have filed to do that. I think, like the Uber and Lyft bills, it's also dead on arrival in our legislature, but it was a proposal that was supported by the Mass AFL-CIO without a lot of debate and discussion, because people perceived it to be an opportunity to give voice to drivers through, this, I guess you could call it a third way, or some, modified or enhanced independent contractor status, independent contractor plus, and limited collective bargaining, and an organization that would have been funded by the employer, not so much by the employees. So anyways, I think there was a number of vice presidents of the Massachusetts AFL-CIO who were concerned about how the timing of that legislation, given that we're in a battle with Uber and Lyft, and also how that legislation could set precedent for, or such a move by the machinists could set a precedent for other jobs that could be vulnerable to apt-based employment that are currently unionized positions in grocery stores or in home care or other fields. So there was a lot of concern about setting a dangerous precedent.
So the third way is something that, was being actively talked about between established unions and the companies in California. And I think there's a reticence among established labor to it's hard to build a democratic driver-led union. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think we're showing that it's possible, right? And so I think, labor is worried about that, thinking there may be a better way to do it. But, thankfully, I think that chapter seems to be put to bed, except by the machinists. Because, I think people have seen that drivers can organize, that dashers can organize, and that we will push back and we will help move, decision makers and that kind of thing. So, but the third way is bad for all the reasons that we talked about. But I think, especially, I know I'm sort of talking to a group of people who think about labor a lot. So I'm just going to say, organizing and developing leaders in this workforce will have huge impact on the future of the labor movement. I mean, one of the first organizing committee meetings we had, we had maybe 30 people in the room who all had shown that they were willing and able to bring people to the movement. And we looked at everybody and we said, if we're going to build to scale, everybody in this room has to become a better organizer. You have the job to be an organizer. People think that RDU has 100 staff people because people say, hi, I'm a driver and I'm an organizer for RDU. So they think we have staff. We have one staff person that we pay for through freaking membership fees and some, allies, who give us a little bit of money. Like, that's it. So it can be done. And we have a responsibility in the labor movement to develop real leaders who can lead this movement into the future. Imagine, we have lost so many great minds to, just like, the shrinking of the labor movement. And this is a great place to develop leaders. So I think it's not just we can win, we can build a union, but it's actually going to help the future of the labor movement, not just the future of work, but this is about the future of organizing. Because, one of the ladies who was in the room when we said that was like, yeah, like not all of us are going to stay in rideshare. We're going to go to other companies where we need to organize as well. So many people who are drivers have left better jobs because they had a horrible boss, because they didn't have power in the workplace and it was easier to be managed by an algorithm that at least didn't yell at you every day. So we have to raise, the ability of the American workforce to organize, not just provide the policies for people to organize.
Yeah, Katie, I see that in the chat, you've dropped this letter that you signed on to. I signed on to it also, critiquing the sectoral bargaining initiative that I think we're discussing here. I don't know if you have more comments on that.
I'll make one analogy on it. And I liked your question, Peter, sort of about this third way question and why it's dangerous. And before I came to labor, I used to study housing, and I come from Ohio, right? That's, plagued with vacant properties. And so to come to DC, this like fancy, wealthy bubble of investment, I heard lots of talks about gentrification. And gentrification was often framed as good because it would bring money and investment to places that didn't have it. And I think when we think about sectoral bargaining, we can think about it like gentrification, that actually we can't think about it as just gentrification or disinvestment. It can't just be DC or Ohio, right? We can imagine, and we must, right, other ways of living. And so when people tell me, but gentrification makes places have better grocery stores, it's like, well, is that like saying a hurricane's great because it waters your garden? Like, sometimes these arguments are a little funny. And so when I think about sectoral bargaining, I think about the hurricane. It's not really the kind of water you want to grow those seeds of care to go full circle.
And you absolutely need the majority of the workforce organized in order to get the kind of contract you need, and even in a sector. We're looking at California. There's more than 200,000 drivers in California, and if you have 20,000 of them organized, what kind of sectoral agreement are you getting?
I come out of a union that has a sectoral bargaining agreement with the giant ocean carriers and stevedoring companies in the West Coast ports. We have one contract for 26 ports. That was not won by a backroom deal between labor leaders and the companies. It was won in the streets with some bloody battles up and down the West Coast. So the history of sectoral bargaining is important to look at, but what it includes is the kind of work that Nicole and Rideshare Drivers United are doing, not backroom deals. Let's open up here. I think we have Bill Orleans. If somebody could unmute him, he has a question. So go ahead, Bill.
Maybe he taking a break.
Oh, okay. Guess he
Some
doesn't
people
have a
check into
question.
these
No, it wasn't
things and
that
then
important.
go get lunch, you know?
Other questions from folks who are with us today? Otherwise, I come back to a couple more questions that I have.
There's a couple questions from Ben Blake. Do I have it right? Uber et al. Are leading an employer effort to make all gig workers and therefore eliminate to all workers, gig workers, and therefore eliminate the rights of all workers. They're leading the way, absolutely. I always say follow the money. Who are these gigantic investors that are willing to invest in this economy, in these businesses for years and years not seeing a return? Why?
What do you mean?
There's some liquid on the ground.
Oh.
I can't tell if one of them pee or what.
Okay.
And then the next question he has is ALEC playing a role in spreading the lobbying effort throughout the states for the anti-gig worker legislation? Somebody want to take that?
Yes. Yeah.
Here's a question. This was a question I had, and it goes to Ben's third question. It seems to me as organizers, particularly to Nicole and Rand, who have—
Hey, Ron, what's up?
Hold on.
Welcome to Raleigh.
Somebody needs to mute.
Please put him
It's
on.
Bill. I got him.
Head up to the Smeltman overpass bridge.
Yeah. This is a question I have for, particularly for Rand and Nicole. As organizers, we face a little bit of a dilemma here because we're dealing with workers who have very near and dear daily issues around the rates, around, who knows, during the pandemic, protective equipment. And as organizers, we need to respond to those issues. How do we do that and also raise up this bigger regulatory issue that we've been talking to throughout this call? In other words, how do we fight a Prop 22 when Jose, the Lyft driver, is asking, how do I get protective equipment during the pandemic? So how do we handle that dilemma? It goes to some of this issue around hybrid organizing techniques, but it's a deeper question. It's an ongoing question in all organizing.
Nicole?
I mean, the issues are there. One of the things I heard somebody say in a training a couple of years ago was, America is a hot shop, right? I mean, the workforce is feeling it really deeply. So, if people organize with old school commitment to worker voice, workers leading, and build a structure that is sustainable, even without a workplace, right? And I think that's where the hybrid comes into play, is you need something to create your workplace ability to communicate, talk to each other, all that, right? And I mean, that's basically our leadership structure, is all of our leaders are creating basically like worker pods that they're responsible for communicating with and bringing in and asking them to come to action. That sort of, I mean, like back in when I was a kid, that's what the PTA had, was, you know, basically a phone tree, right? And there were many branches and many leaves on those branches, and you could reach everybody in 24 hours when you just gave the call to the first 10 people, right? And that's what we need, right? We need to rebuild those connections. People have a lot of energy to organize and then to do real things. Don't just put a bunch of people in front of, you know, an Uber office with signs, but fight for things that drivers want and need. You know, so we have two things. We're fighting for better things for drivers now, right? I mean, right now it was getting through the labyrinth of unemployment when we were misclassified. When we qualified for unemployment, the employers were calling us independent contractors, but we were really under the law employees. So how do we get unemployment from a system, a huge bureaucracy that is not set up for misclassified workers and is overburdened by the millions who are unemployed? That was, we had to help people through that process. But at the same time, keeping our eyes on the goals, which is fair pay, a voice on the job. How are we going to do that? Let's overturn 22. Well, we'll do, that's hard. Let's overrule it with national legislation. So people know they're fighting right now for each other, and we have each other's backs, and we have a structure to support that. We have through our software. And then we also are extremely focused on what's happening in DC and to make the most of this opportunity to secure drivers' rights.
Great. I don't have anything to add to that, Peter. Good organizing connects those day-to-day issues with larger issues. And if you know, it's imperative to connect the dots for people, or, you know, assist in that. But I think people will get it. We've got a couple of hands raised, Peter.
Yeah. Katie, do you want to add anything on this point? Okay, I think Bill is now ready to rumble. Go ahead, Bill. Put your question out there.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry I wasn't near Wi-Fi earlier. The sister earlier started by speaking. Well, first let me say that if I wasn't interested in advancing workers' rights, I wouldn't have registered for this convening, nor would I have any interest in what KI does. I very much support all workers' rights all the time. But the sister earlier mentioned that she started her experience with Lyft because she needed extra income. And of course, nobody who's working at a job should be required to seek a second job because they need extra income in order to live. They're seeking extra income, denies others whose primary income comes from transporting people from point to point. Lyft and Uber, from the very beginning, should have been fought successfully by local governments, local jurisdictions, and of course they were not. The fact that they've been able to extend their domain this many years and accumulate enough investor capital to override state governments in their attempt to regulate Uber and Lyft functions is a separate question. But I absolutely support workers who find themselves doing Uber and Lyft and the others right to organize. But primarily, I would think at some point we should try and rectify the interests of the traditional point-to-point transport, and that is cab drivers. I as angered as I am by this discussion of Uber and Lyft, I note the irony first that all the problems being addressed by the sister today from Lyft and all the Uber and Lyft drivers I've heard over the recent years parallel exactly the problems of taxi drivers over the years who were attempting to organize nationally and were confronted by local jurisdictions that did not regulate the locally licensed taxi industries and were the taxi industries were allowed to classify their drivers as independent contractors. Let me just say that I support all Uber and Lyft drivers, but in the long run, such transport should not be the domain of private investor capital or any private capital. It should be, that function should be performed by transit agencies around the country. I thank you for letting me speak.
Yep.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the best example of organizing together is in New York, where the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, a couple years ago, in a big room full of taxi drivers and Lyft and Uber drivers, they made a unity agreement and have agreed to fight together because they know they're in the same thing. And, right now we see Lyft and Uber drivers fighting for the loan forgiveness that the taxi workers need for their medallions, right? And we see taxi drivers fighting for the things that Lyft and Uber drivers need. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely it. We're set up as, I'm set up as a disruptor to the taxi industry. It has decimated their ability to earn as well. We have to raise all ships.
I think Victor, Katie, you want to respond on that?
I want to add one point, because I think, Bill, what you said is so great for understanding the context of the struggles of Uber drivers. Because I'm thinking specifically in the DC area, there's a group in North Virginia called Virginia New Majority. And they explicitly understood from the beginning that unless the taxi drivers and the Uber and Lyft drivers could find common ground, we were not going to advance in any way. And what we missed from the very beginning here, and still miss, is a supportive ATU, the Amalgamated Transit Union, who, while doing amazing work, right, for our subway and our bus workers, right, have from the very get-go sort of said, well, I don't know what to do about Uber drivers. We think many of our members moonlight as Uber drivers, and so we do represent them, but not in their day job. And so as long as we continue to have, this segmented, movement, right, we can't build what Nicole said we need, right, which is that broad-based coalition. And so bringing taxi workers into the scene, I think, is key.
Peter, I had a conversation with a leader of Local 32 BJ in Massachusetts, which is the union for building service workers. And many of those employees cannot live in Boston. Those members, union members, can't live in Boston on the wages and benefits that they have for their full-time job working as a commercial cleaner or contract labor at the airport, or custodians at area universities. They can't afford to live in Boston on one paycheck, and they are working as Uber and Lyft drivers. And we had a great discussion about that reality.
Great, thank you. I think Victor is on stack and wanting to ask a question and make a comment. Go ahead, Victor.
Just seems like geography and community are the central issues here. So what I'm wondering about, isn't something like the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, what they did with the steel companies back in the 30s, might serve as kind of a useful historical precedent here? Because in that case, the mine workers funded the union effort there to kind of take control or connect to workers where the companies weren't necessarily all that present and cognizant. And so look where in the geography where the Uber and Lyft are present is the way for the off kilter, or does that seem something that's doable?
Organizers, response. It's a good observation. I think we're going to move on to Patrick's question.
Victor, I'm happy to talk to you about that. It's a lot to unpack. because I'm open to strategies, like, let's go.
Patrick, did you have a question?
I just want to thank the organizers for this. I just think that there's going to have to be a coalition here between these all these different gig workers and the non-gig workers, and it's going to have to be around protecting the New Deal and protecting the classification of employees. And it's a very dangerous point where we are, because some of the people in the labor movement believe we need to go in a different direction, and that different direction under Prop 22 is going to eviscerate unemployment, workman's comp, all of these different things that we take for granted, all the way up through the Great Society, whether it's Medicare or whether it's Social Security. And I'm somebody that's out of the transportation sector. And in 1980, when we had the deregulation of the trucking industry, and we ended up with a wholesale misclassification taking place in trucking. And now we're seeing it, I guess, 3 cubed, with the Uberization of transport. And it's going to require coalitions. It's going to require a lot of discussions from a lot of people. And unfortunately, we're going to have to stop the triangulation that's going on within the Democratic Party, where we've got people like Barbara Boxer, a longtime friend of ours, supporting Prop 22. And we've also got Fabian Nunez, and we've got, unbelievably, Antonio Villagrosa, and I could blab all day about this. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for doing something on this, and don't mourn, organize. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you, Patrick. It's good to hear from you as always. Patrick,
Peter, I think
very
one of the
capable Teamster leader from Southern California, so we welcome his comments and observations. Rand, go ahead.
Well, just teeing off of that, a big question in Massachusetts will be whether, we can hold the Democrats to oppose this Uber Lyft initiative, and can we, where will the intelligentsia and the suburban progressives, where are they going to go? Are they going to be, suckered in and fooled? Or can we hold them? Because that's critical to winning the vote. And I think it's that question's definitely up for grabs.
Yeah. And I would say I feel like in the California fight, it was us drivers who held both Democrats and labor's feet to the fire on this issue, and folks came out supporting us, which is fantastic, right? And we couldn't just sit on the industry's lies that drivers want to be independent. There's some kind of mystique around independence. I want to be independent, but I want some rights too, right? So I think that's important. I think the other thing is there are unions that are strongly supporting, drivers organizing. I mean, Transport Workers Union certainly has been very helpful to us over, the course of stuff. Over the course of a couple of years has been really helpful. UFCW, who is losing union jobs to, Postmates, they're really trying to see how they can also support app-based driving. So I think, there is stuff happening, and but independent driver groups need support. I mean, like I said, we have one employee. And it's just, the way we're organizing, which I think is absolutely powerful and absolutely the right way to go, is that drivers are organizing drivers. But we could do so much more,
Yeah. I just, apropos of that, it's important that people go to the Rideshare Drivers United Facebook page and website and donate generously to this important organization. I gave them my stimulus check, and I would encourage others to do the same, because this work has to be supported. We're coming down to closing minutes here. I do want to give Katie, Rand, and Nicole a shot at final comments unless there's other folks who want to ask questions. I don't see any. Sometimes I'm not managing technology correctly, but I don't see any questions. So I guess I'll start with Katie, if you'd like to make some closing remarks.
I just like to, it's been absolutely lovely to get to learn from you guys.
Nicole, any final thoughts?
I want to say thanks too. This is a really great group. And, you know, Peter, your support of, you know, drivers' voices is really important to what's happening. So I just, you know, it is crushing, you know, legislation like Prop 22. It is crushing to drivers. It is crushing to all of us, you know, to see the rug, you know, swept out from under us, and it's legal now. You know, I mean, that is just, you know, when you're on the road for, you know, 3 hours and you bring home $20 and that's now legal, and then half of that goes into your gas tank. Like, that's what we're talking about. But I also see, if we support the organizing of drivers all over the country and, you know, honestly, the world, if we support that and we really find models that can help build worker power in the sector, we can actually, it's an opportunity, you know, it's an opportunity that can really help us coast into a much stronger, you know, labor future. And I just want to really emphasize that. Don't just come away feeling bummed.
Rand, some closing thoughts?
Well, I just posted the link to the International Alliance of App-Based Workers that I believe RDU is a member of, as well as the BIDG. And you know, we're going to be looking to everybody on this Zoom and at this conference to support our campaign in Massachusetts. We're going to, you know, we're not going to compete financially with what they can put up for their initiative, but it will need, you know, millions of dollars just to run a credible campaign with a good ground game and, you know, the support of all of the building the kind of coalition that Nicole and Katie talked about. It's going to take everybody, you know, putting their shoulder to the wheel and recognizing that it's a national fight. I don't know how viable this is, but I did want to post in the chat that some of the people in New York that were part of the machinists organization there broke away and started and created their own, you know, worker-owned company that has their, you know, they have a proprietary app that they're using that people can buy into. It's kind of interesting, and so that's something that we all also look at as we think about the future of work. You know, that we should be creating as jobs worth owning, and perhaps at some point, you know, a worker-owned app could compete with Uber and Lyft. Who knows? Another world is possible.
Okay, thank you to all our panelists and our participants. I just want to say that this is an issue that I feel very emotional about. 4 years ago, I was contacted by Ivan Pardo, who was a software and app designer, and he said, I want to organize Uber and Lyft. And I said, well, have you done any organizing? He said, no, but I've done app development. I said, well, good luck to you and the Red Sox. And but then 4 years later, this is the guy who's developed this tool that enables this hybrid organizing that Nicole's been talking about. So I saw this thing in its infancy grow to strikes at LAX, to strikes when, you know, Uber's issuing their IPO, and grow to an organization of 19,000 drivers. So that's the kind of organizing we need in our labor movement. And I salute the work of RDU, and I salute everyone on this panel. So thank you, everyone. Have a great Saturday, May Day, International Workers' Day.
Woo-hoo. Thanks, Peter.